a lot of folks are having to do this themselves. So on a typical day, on a Saturday, I may hit the St. Paul Farmers Market, having picked up my CSA box the night before at somebody's house, drive to the ethnic grocery store to grab my olive oil, head to the pickup site to get my meat from one of the farmers, and hit my boss up for a dozen eggs because she's got chickens that she's raising. And so what I've got is 5 or 6 sites that I'm sourcing myself and building a relationship directly to the person who's growing it. And then there's some piece of the puzzle in here, too, where you can source locally, but a lot of folks are taking this responsibility on themselves. So what we're seeing is this highly fragmented state where you can't head for 1 or 2 shops and get everything you need. You've got to piece it together and figure it out. We're also seeing a lot of micro-entrepreneurship. So you may see folks at farmers markets, they're not necessarily making enough money to live off of. They may be augmenting their annual or their monthly budget. But what we're seeing is a lot of these small businesses banking on a longer-term future interest more broadly with the public in local foods. So what does that mean? People like me are paying a price premium. We're visiting farmers markets. Folks are doing the food production, are saying this is what's really good for community right now, so we're going to build the social capital now and worry about the payoff later because we're investing in the future food system that we really want for our communities and for our society. And so what we're seeing in this local foods movement with all these characteristics is a lot of folks are paying attention to that sector B and some to A and C in this, but this is where the real action is right now in Minnesota with the local foods movement. Oops, I'm going backwards.
One thing?
Please.
We've been doing quite a bit of community gardening here, too, which kind of fits in between A and B.
That's right. Kind of this in-between-this part. Yep. Right. Yep. So if, in fact, it's Sector B, what's Sector C look like? Well, what we're seeing right now with the local foods movement in Minnesota and nationally is thus far very few systems level levers are being pushed. In other words, if schools want to feature local foods in their school lunches, there's no broad way to do that. Each and every school district has to figure out for themselves what red tape to cut, what loopholes they can hop through, which farmers they can get from, how they pull the money together to do it, and then do they not have the kitchen to prep this food. So what we're seeing is there's no systems level support for these schools. They all have to duct tape and baling wire it themselves. We also see in retail outlets there's very small availability of local foods in most grocery stores, and it's inconsistent. So you can't, you may get apples, Minnesota apples at a certain time of year, but, like you said, in April it's slim pickings when it comes to Minnesota fruit in stores. So we've got this issue of a small and inconsistent supply where the demand for local foods far outpaces the supply and availability of it for folks who are interested in buying it. The other piece, as I mentioned, is because we're hanging out so much in Sector B, the distribution and sourcing is individual. There aren't good distribution systems in place to aggregate supply and get it out to the major outlets where most people buy their food. There's not a lot of people, like all of you, growing, canning, hunting, preparing food. An awful lot of folks in Minnesota are eating pre-prepared foods, or they make one stop a week and it's one grocery store, and so they want everything in one spot. So this distribution and sourcing thus far hasn't been aggregated to source that Sector C part. So what we're seeing is something really great. This is an absolutely fabulous social movement. I call it the Velvet Revolution. It's people taking back their dinner plate, people taking back their food system, people reimagining agriculture in a way that's very exciting and saying, we're just going to build this thing ourselves in our backyard with our families and within our communities. And so we see a ton of creativity, but it's kind of unpredictable right now. We don't know where it's going. There's all of this interest, and it hasn't fully shaken out yet. It's kind of in its adolescent stage of maturity, and there's a lot of change happening all the time. The other piece that we're seeing nationally is the W.K. Kellogg Foundation is the national philanthropic leader in the local foods movement. They said, we're really the only major foundation that's paying attention to sustainable agriculture. We're going to dump a whole gajillion dollars into building what they refer to as the good food movement. And the idea with the good food movement is that it's creating 10% of the food that Americans eat, making space for it in the market that's locally produced. But what does local mean? Does it mean Jenny O? No, they have a definition that would leave Jenny O out of that camp. First of all, local means that it's fair. to the workers who work there, not just in terms of wages, but also working conditions. That it's fair to farmers, that they can get a fair price for the product that they're growing and selling, and also that it's fair to the animals, that they're treated humanely. Good food has to be affordable. It can't be an elitist movement that this high-end gourmet food is only available to those who can afford it. It needs to be easy to get to, but it also should be affordable, not only for the people who are eating it, but also for the farmers who are producing it. It should be affordable to produce local food. It should be green. That the practices that farmers use on the landscape, the processing, the distribution, and the transportation should help minimize the impact on the environment, and in many cases may actually provide ecological benefits. And that it's small, that it should be locally owned. Thanks. It should be locally owned and operated. That it's from here for here, says one of the farmers that I work with. So Kellogg Foundation has said by 2017, they would like to see 10% of local foods available in retail outlets around the country. Now, the interesting thing is 2/3 of the grocery stores nationally in the U.S. are owned by regional or local chains. So unlike most other consolidation of industries, there's still a fair amount of wiggle room in the retail grocery outlet. And so the Kellogg Foundation has said, well, this is an inroad for us, and this is where most Americans get their food, so let's try and make an impact here. And you could see many of you are well above that 10% mark in your local foods consumption, but many Americans are far below that 10% mark. So it's a pretty ambitious goal, and what that means is you guys are the early adopters and leaders in this movement to get an increasing number of folks accessing and eating locally produced foods. Now, one thing I should say about this issue about selling in retail outlets is one of the challenges of this paradigm is it means that the farmer or the producer gets paid less for the food that they produce by selling it through retail outlets. So one of the big challenges we have in reimagining our food system so that it supports local production of food is that we saturate those markets where farmers get the best price first. So let's talk about Minnesota. Now you've seen the national picture. So what's happening with local foods in Minnesota? Well, in the last decade, we've more than quadrupled the number of farmers markets across the state. This is not just in the Twin Cities. This is a phenomenon that you're seeing from very small communities to more significant urban areas. And Minnesota has a very high number of community-supported agriculture. So a lot of people are paying their annual membership and getting their box of produce. I like the ones that have flowers in them, too. But there's a wonderful variety of community-supported agricultural entities in Minnesota. We're also seeing this uptick in people saying, we want to eat more whole foods in our diet, and so we're going to look for natural foods co-ops and natural foods grocery stores that we can access some of these things. And then you also see a lot of people buying stuff on the net that they may not be able to get in their home community. So local foods and health foods that they're purchasing online. And then finally, as I mentioned before, there's this movement of people looking back at what their grandma did or their grandpa and saying, I'm going to pick this up and start doing it again, or I'm not going to let this thing go. I'm going to teach my kids and make sure we can continue this legacy. So we're seeing a lot of this kind of activity on the scene in Minnesota with respect to the local foods movement. Minnesota's focusing on Sector B right now, too. We're seeing this expansion and then also an investment in making sure those farmers markets can stay open. You can throw several $1,000s into a farmer's market, but if it's only making a couple $100s a weekend, it's not going to be around for very long. So there's not only the sustainability question financially, there's also some training dimensions to help folks who are growing food become astute and capable business people as well. There's also a focus on season extension. So how do people in Crookston, Minnesota produce as much local foods as they can so when they get to April, their growing season's already started. So they're really trying to look at this issue of how do we extend the growing season long enough to continue to produce as much of our own produce as we can. Then there's this question of public awareness. There's all sorts of ways that nonprofit organizations and communities are working to build public awareness about local foods. Lots of school districts are trying this farm-to-school thing. And then Land Stewardship Project, we have a couple folks, Caroline is one of them from Land Stewardship Project, who's really been thinking through if the bulk of farmers in Minnesota are over 55 years old, who's going to be growing those local foods that we all want in the next 10 years? Well, the answer is different farmers. And so how is it that we prepare and train farmers and help them get the resources and connections they need to be able to be stewards of the landscape and produce the food that we all want to eat. So there's been a lot of leadership there. And then finally, lots and lots of social capital. All these local food events like this one, where people are coming together in community to talk and learn and eat local foods. Movement building of community around local foods with a strong focus on that Sector B. Yes, sir?
Organic Valley, which is over in Lafarge, Wisconsin.
Right.
So I believe, if not the largest, it is one of the largest organic foods supply organizations in the country.
Right.
Where do you see that fitting into this discussion?